Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Philosophy. Tonight we're embarking on a gentle journey into the mind of one of history's most misunderstood thinkers, a philosopher whose ideas were so radical that they shattered the foundations of Western thought like a hammer striking glass. This is Friedrich Nietzsche, the man who declared that God is dead, who spoke of becoming superhuman, and who believed that we must create our own values in a world stripped of absolute meaning. But don't worry, we won't be charging through his philosophy like a thunderbolt across the sky. No, this is a slow, contemplative exploration designed to help you unwind, rest your mind, and perhaps drift off before we reach the depths of his most challenging ideas. Tonight, we'll let Nietzsche's thoughts wash over us like a gentle tide, exploring how his revolutionary philosophy might actually bring us peace rather than turmoil. Before we begin our descent into the labyrinth of Nietzschean thought, if you find this kind of philosophical storytelling helpful, whether it sends you to sleep or simply settles your restless thoughts, consider giving the video a like and subscribing to Sleepy Philosophy. It helps more weary souls find their way here. And just out of curiosity, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments, and feel free to share your local time. Whether it's midnight in Munich or 3 in the morning in Tokyo, you're very welcome in this quiet corner of contemplation. So settle in. Perhaps you're lying in bed, the lights are low and your pillow is perfectly arranged. Take a deep breath and let the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders. Nietzsche's philosophy awaits, and though his ideas once shook the world, tonight they'll serve as a gentle companion to your journey into rest. Picture this: a small town in 19th century Germany, where the son of a Lutheran pastor grows up surrounded by the certainties of faith, tradition, and moral absolutes. The young Friedrich Nietzsche seemed destined for a life within these comfortable boundaries, perhaps following his father into the clergy. But something stirred within this quiet boy, a restless questioning that would eventually lead him to tear down everything his world held sacred. It began not with rebellion, but with love. A love of ancient Greece, of Homer's heroes and tragic poets who sang of glory and suffering with equal passion. As a student, Nietzsche became enchanted by a world where gods walked among mortals, where honour mattered more than comfort, and where life was lived with an intensity that seemed to have vanished from his own Christian era. This ancient world whispered to him of different possibilities, of ways of being human that his contemporary society had forgotten. The Greeks, he noticed, had faced the fundamental meaninglessness of existence without flinching. They had looked into the abyss of a godless universe and responded not with despair, but with art, beauty, and a fierce embrace of life itself. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's slow down and breathe with Nietzsche as he makes his first tentative steps away from the comfortable certainties of his youth. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was a gradual awakening, like dawn breaking slowly over a landscape that had been shrouded in mist. As a young professor of classical philology, Nietzsche spent his days immersed in ancient texts, but his evenings were often filled with a growing sense of unease. The Christian morality that had shaped his upbringing began to feel like ill-fitting clothes, constraining and artificial. He started to see it not as divine truth, but as a human creation, one that had perhaps outlived its usefulness. This realization didn't come as a flash of insight, but as a slow, sometimes painful process of questioning everything he had been taught to believe. Imagine the vertigo of discovering that the ground you thought was solid has always been shifting beneath your feet. This is what Nietzsche experienced as he began to see morality, religion, and truth itself as human constructions rather than eternal absolutes. The key moment in this transformation came through his encounter with Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy. Schopenhauer had already declared that life was essentially suffering, that existence was a cruel joke played by a blind, irrational will. But where Schopenhauer counselled resignation and withdrawal from life, Nietzsche began to sense different possibilities. What if, instead of fleeing from life's difficulties, we could learn to dance with them? What if suffering wasn't something to be avoided at all costs, but something that could be transformed into strength, wisdom, even joy? These questions would eventually bloom into some of Nietzsche's most powerful insights, but for now, let them settle gently in your mind like snowflakes on a quiet winter evening. The young philosopher's health was never robust. He suffered from severe headaches, stomach ailments, and periods of near blindness that forced him to dictate his thoughts rather than write them himself. In a way, his physical frailty became a laboratory for testing in pain still affirm life. Could weakness his emerging philosophy? Could someone who was often be transformed into a different kind of strength? These weren't abstract questions for Nietzsche. They were lived experiences, daily challenges that forced him to examine the relationship between suffering and meaning, between limitation and creativity. As you listen to these words, perhaps from your own place of rest or recovery, consider how our limitations might sometimes become doorways to deeper understanding. Nietzsche's first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, emerged from this period of questioning and discovery. In it, he proposed that the highest achievements of human culture arise from the marriage of two opposing forces. He called these the Apollonian and the Dionysian, after two Greek gods who represented very different approaches to existence. Apollo represented order, reason, clarity, and beautiful illusion. Think of a perfectly sculpted statue, serene and eternal, or a mathematical equation that captures some fundamental truth about the universe. The Apollonian impulse seeks to create form, to impose meaning, to make the chaotic world comprehensible and beautiful. Dionysus, on the other hand, represented intoxication, ecstasy, the dissolution of individual boundaries, and the raw power of life itself. Picture a wild celebration where people lose themselves in music and dance, where the ordinary rules of society fall away, and where individuals merge into something larger and more primal. Most philosophical traditions had seen these forces as enemies, with reason needing to triumph over passion, order over chaos. But Nietzsche proposed something revolutionary, that the greatest human achievements came not from the victory of one over the other, but from their creative tension, their dance together. Greek tragedy, he argued, was the perfect example of this synthesis. The tragic heroes faced impossible situations with both rational understanding and passionate intensity. They neither retreated into pure reason nor abandoned themselves to mindless emotion. Instead, they embraced the full spectrum of human experience, including its most painful aspects, and transformed that embrace into art. This insight would become central to everything Nietzsche wrote afterward. Life, he began to understand, wasn't a problem to be solved, but a work of art to be created. The goal wasn't to eliminate suffering or achieve perfect happiness, but to forge something meaningful and beautiful from whatever materials existence provided. As you rest tonight, let this idea settle gently into your consciousness. Perhaps the struggles you face, the imperfections in your life, the things that cause you worry or pain, aren't obstacles to be overcome but raw materials waiting to be shaped into something uniquely yours. But Nietzsche's philosophy was just beginning to take shape. His early insights about the Apollonian and Dionysian were like seeds that would eventually grow into a forest of interconnected ideas. The notion that we must create our own values, that traditional morality might be holding us back, that human beings have untapped potential for greatness, all of these themes were already stirring in his mind. His personal life during this period was marked by increasing isolation. His radical ideas made him few friends in academic circles, and his deteriorating health forced him to resign his professorship at the unusually young age of 34. But this isolation, painful as it must have been, also gave him the freedom to think without constraints, to follow his philosophical investigations wherever they might lead. He began to see himself as a kind of philosophical physician, diagnosing the spiritual illnesses of his age. European civilization, he believed, was sick with what he would later call nihilism, a creeping sense that nothing really mattered, that all values were empty, that life had no inherent meaning or purpose. The traditional sources of meaning, religion, and conventional morality were losing their power to inspire and guide human behavior. But Nietzsche didn't see this crisis as purely negative. Like a forest fire that clears away dead undergrowth to make room for new growth, the collapse of old certainties might create space for something unprecedented and magnificent. What if human beings could learn to create their own purposes, to become artists of their own existence? This question would drive much of his mature philosophy, but the path to answering it would require him to venture into territories that few philosophers had dared to explore. He would need to examine the foundations of morality itself, to trace the historical development of our deepest beliefs about good and evil, and to ask whether these beliefs were helping or hindering human flourishing. The journey ahead would take him through some of the darkest insights about human nature and society, but also towards some of the most inspiring visions of human potential ever conceived. He would speak of eternal recurrence, of the will to power, of the possibility of becoming something beyond merely human. But we're moving too quickly. Philosophy, like sleep, requires patience. Let these initial ideas rest in your mind like seeds in fertile soil. Nietzsche's revolutionary insights emerged slowly, through years of careful thought and lived experience. His philosophy wasn't built in a day, and it doesn't need to be understood in a single evening. As you settle deeper into rest, consider the young professor walking alone through the Swiss Alps, his mind churning with questions that would reshape how we think about values, meaning, and human possibility. The traditional answers were crumbling around him, but in that collapse he sensed the birth of something new. The path ahead would be challenging, sometimes disturbing, but ultimately liberating. Nietzsche was about to embark on a philosophical adventure that would take him beyond the comfortable categories of good and evil, beyond the familiar landmarks of traditional morality, into uncharted territories of human potential. Tonight, we begin that journey with him, but at the pace of contemplation rather than conquest, letting his ideas unfold like a slow-blooming flower in the garden of consciousness. The radical philosopher who once declared war on conventional wisdom will tonight serve as a gentle guide toward deeper understanding of ourselves and our possibilities. Now, as the young Nietzsche wandered through the mountains surrounding Basel, something profound was crystallizing in his mind. The traditional moral framework that had guided Western civilization for centuries was beginning to look less like divine commandment and more like a historical accident, a set of rules that had emerged from particular circumstances and served particular purposes. But this wasn't the cynical observation of someone who simply wanted to abandon all restraint. Nietzsche was too thoughtful, too careful an observer of human nature for such simplicity. Instead, he was beginning to ask a question that would haunt and inspire him for the rest of his philosophical career. If our current moral system is indeed a human creation, what kind of humans did it create, and what kind might we become if we chose differently? This inquiry would eventually lead him to one of his most famous and misunderstood concepts, the idea of master and slave morality. But let's approach this gently, like archaeologists carefully brushing dust from ancient artifacts, because these terms carry heavy historical baggage that can obscure Nietzsche's actual insights. Imagine two different responses to hardship and limitation. The first response looks at obstacles and asks, how can I overcome this? How can I grow stronger, more skillful, more creative in the face of this challenge? This approach treats difficulties as opportunities for self-development, as chances to discover untapped capabilities. The second response looks at the same obstacles and asks, who can I blame for this? What external force is responsible for my suffering? This approach seeks comfort through the identification of villains and victims, through the creation of moral categories that explain away personal powerlessness. Nietzsche suggested that these two responses had crystallized over centuries into entirely different moral systems, each with its own virtues, its own understanding of what makes life worth living. The first, which he called master morality, valued strength, creativity, nobility of spirit, and the courage to create one's own values. The second, slave morality, valued humility, compassion, equality, and adherence to universal moral rules. Neither system was inherently right or wrong, Nietzsche believed. They were simply different tools, different ways of organizing human life and meaning. But he worried that his own era had become too dominated by the second approach, that people had forgotten how to affirm life directly, how to create beauty and meaning from their own strength, rather than defining themselves primarily in opposition to others. As you lie there in the gentle darkness, consider your own relationship to difficulty. When challenges arise in your life, do you first look inward to your own resources and creative possibilities, or do you first look outward to identify the sources of your frustration? Neither response is necessarily better, but Nietzsche invited us to notice which patterns we fall into automatically, and whether those patterns serve our deepest aspirations. The philosopher's investigation into morality wasn't driven by abstract curiosity. He was witnessing what he saw as a spiritual crisis in European culture, a gradual loss of vitality and creative energy that he traced to the dominance of life-denying values. People were becoming, he feared, increasingly passive, increasingly dependent on external authorities to tell them what to think and feel and value. But embedded within this diagnosis was a tremendous hope. If moral systems were indeed human creations, then human beings retain the power to create new ones. If the current arrangement was producing spiritual sickness, then perhaps a different arrangement could produce spiritual health, even greatness. This hope would eventually blossom into Nietzsche's vision of the Übermensch, often translated as Superman or Overman, but perhaps better understood as the human being who has learned to create their own values, to be their own authority, to affirm life fully without needing external justification or approval. But we're still in the foothills of Nietzsche's thinking. The path to his mature insights required him first to undertake what he called a genealogy of morals, a careful tracing of how our current moral beliefs had evolved over time. Like a detective investigating a crime scene, he wanted to understand not just what people believed, but how those beliefs had come to seem natural and inevitable. This investigation led him into some of the darkest corners of human psychology. He examined the role of resentment in moral reasoning, the way that feelings of powerlessness could transform themselves into elaborate systems of judgment and condemnation. He explored how suffering had been given meaning through various religious and philosophical frameworks, and asked whether all those frameworks truly served human flourishing. The process was sometimes disturbing, even for Nietzsche himself. To question the foundations of morality is to risk a kind of vertigo, a sense that the ground beneath one's feet has become uncertain. But he pressed forward, driven by the conviction that only by understanding how we had become who we were could we begin to imagine who we might become. In his notebooks from this period, we can sense both the exhilaration and the loneliness of his philosophical adventure. He was charting territories that few minds had explored, but the journey required him to distance himself from the comfortable certainties that most people use to navigate their days. His health continued to deteriorate during these years of intense thinking. The headaches became more severe, his eyesight more unreliable, his social isolation more complete. But in a strange way, these limitations seemed to sharpen rather than dull his philosophical vision. Forced to distill his thoughts into concentrated bursts of insight, he developed a writing style that was both poetic and precise, both accessible and profound. It was during this period that he began to develop his distinctive voice as a philosopher, a voice that could move seamlessly from playful irony to devastating critique to soaring affirmation. He learned to write philosophy like music, with themes that would appear, develop, disappear, and return transformed. His books became less like systematic treatises and more like collections of insights, observations, and experiments in thinking. The experiment that would prove most influential was his attempt to imagine what it would mean to live without the traditional consolations of religion and conventional morality. What would it feel like to accept full responsibility for creating meaning in one's own life? What kind of strength would such acceptance require, and what kind of joy might it make possible? These questions led him toward one of his most challenging and beautiful concepts, the idea of eternal recurrence. Suppose, he asked, you were told that your life, exactly as you have lived it, with all its pleasures and pains, its triumphs and failures, its moments of glory and periods of despair, would repeat itself infinitely, down to the smallest detail. How would this knowledge change your relationship to your current choices? Would you feel crushed by the weight of endless repetition, or would you find a way to embrace even the difficult parts of your existence? Could you learn to live in such a way that you would welcome the eternal return of every moment? The question wasn't meant to be answered quickly or easily. It was designed to serve as a kind of spiritual exercise, a way of testing the depth of your life affirmation. Someone who could genuinely embrace eternal recurrence would be someone who had learned to find meaning and value even in suffering, someone who had developed what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate. As these ideas settle into your consciousness tonight, let them rest gently rather than demanding immediate understanding. Nietzsche's insights emerged from years of careful thought and lived experience. They invite contemplation rather than quick judgment, patience rather than hasty application. The philosopher walking through those Alpine valleys was slowly discovering that the collapse of traditional certainties didn't have to lead to despair. It could instead open up space for a more authentic, more creative, more fully human way of being in the world. The death of old gods might herald the birth of new possibilities for those brave enough to embrace the responsibility of self-creation. But the path forward wouldn't be simple or comfortable. It would require what Nietzsche called a revaluation of all values, a careful examination of every inherited belief to determine whether it served life and growth or merely provided the illusion of security. It would demand the courage to stand alone when necessary, to think independently even when such thinking led to unpopular conclusions. Most challenging of all, it would require learning to love life not because it was easy or pleasant or fair, but because it was the only life available, the raw material from which meaning and beauty could be forged through human creativity and will. The young professor had no way of knowing that his philosophical investigations would eventually influence psychology, literature, politics, and art in ways that are still unfolding today. He was simply following his questions wherever they led, trusting that honest thinking, however difficult, was preferable to comfortable delusion. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you this image of the solitary thinker, walking mountain paths with his thoughts for company, slowly discovering that the human capacity for creating meaning and value was far greater than he had ever imagined. The journey beyond good and evil was just beginning, but already the destination was becoming clearer. Not a place of moral chaos, but a realm of creative possibility where humans might finally become who they truly are. The mountain air grew thinner as Nietzsche climbed higher, both literally and metaphorically, into territories that few human minds had dared to explore. His physical weakness seemed almost to fuel his intellectual strength, as if the fragility of his body had concentrated all his energy into the fierce flame of thought. During these years of isolation and illness, he was forging concepts that would eventually reshape how we understand human nature, creativity, and the very possibility of meaning in a godless universe. But let's pause here, in this quiet moment of philosophical genesis, and breathe with the rhythm of his discovery. Nietzsche's insights didn't arrive as thunderbolts of revelation. They grew slowly, like crystals forming in a cave, each new understanding building upon the last, creating structures of thought that were both beautiful and unsettling. One of the most profound realizations emerging during this period was his understanding of what he would later call the will to power. This wasn't the crude desire to dominate others that the phrase might suggest to modern ears. Instead, it was something far more subtle and fundamental, the basic drive of all life to grow, to expand, to overcome obstacles, to create new possibilities for itself. Nietzsche observed this principle everywhere he looked. Plants pushing through concrete, artists struggling to express their vision, children learning to walk despite countless falls, lovers pursuing connection despite the risk of heartbreak. All of life, he began to see, was animated by this fundamental urge to transcend its current limitations, to become more than it currently was. Even suffering viewed through this lens took on a different meaning. Pain wasn't simply an evil to be avoided, but often a sign that growth was occurring, that old patterns were being broken down to make room for new ones. The caterpillar's dissolution in the chrysalis wasn't a tragedy, but a necessary transformation, a dying that enabled flying. As you rest tonight, consider the struggles in your own life through this gentle perspective. Perhaps the difficulties you face aren't punishments or accidents, but invitations to discover strengths you didn't know you possessed. Maybe the parts of yourself that you've tried to suppress or overcome contain energies that could be redirected rather than eliminated, transformed rather than destroyed. This insight led Nietzsche to a radical re-examination of traditional virtues and vices. What if some of the qualities that conventional morality labelled as evil were actually distorted expressions of life-affirming energies? What if anger, properly channeled, could become righteous passion for justice? What if pride, freed from its defensive aspects, could become healthy self-respect and confidence? The philosopher wasn't advocating for moral relativism or suggesting that all actions were equally valid. Instead, he was proposing a more sophisticated approach to ethics, one that looked beyond surface behaviours to the underlying life forces they expressed. A action that seemed virtuous on the surface might actually spring from resentment, fear, or weakness, while an apparently selfish act might emerge from genuine self-love and creative energy. This perspective required what Nietzsche called psychological subtlety, the ability to perceive the complex motivations beneath human behaviour. Most moral systems, he argued, were too crude in their categorizations, too willing to paint the rich complexity of human nature in simple blacks and whites. During his long, solitary walks through the Swiss countryside, these insights began to coalesce into a vision of human potential that was both inspiring and daunting. If traditional morality was indeed holding people back from their full development, what would it look like for someone to break free from these constraints? What would a truly self-created individual be like? The answer that emerged was his concept of the Übermensch, the human being who had learned to create their own values, rather than inheriting them from tradition, religion, or social pressure. This wasn't a biological superman with supernatural powers, but someone who had achieved a kind of spiritual mastery, who could look at the raw materials of existence and forge from them something beautiful and meaningful. Such individuals wouldn't reject all conventional values out of rebellious spite. Instead, they would examine each inherited belief carefully, keeping what served life and growth while discarding what had become dead weight. They would be neither slaves to tradition, nor prisoners of reaction against it, but free creators of their own moral landscape. The path to such freedom, however, was neither quick nor easy. It required what Nietzsche called the Great Liberation, a process of gradually freeing oneself from the unconscious assumptions that shaped most human behaviour. This liberation often began with a period of skepticism and questioning that could feel deeply unsettling. Imagine discovering that many of the beliefs you'd held most dear were not eternal truths, but temporary constructions, useful perhaps in their time, but no longer serving your growth. The initial response might be panic, a desperate grasping for some new certainty to replace the old. But Nietzsche suggested that this transitional period of uncertainty, uncomfortable as it might be, was actually a necessary prelude to genuine freedom. He called this intermediate stage the free spirit, and he saw it as a crucial phase in human development. Free spirits had learned to question inherited values, but hadn't yet developed the strength to create new ones. They existed in a kind of philosophical limbo, liberated from old constraints but not yet capable of full self-determination. This phase could last for years, even decades. It required tremendous patience and courage to live without the comfortable certainties that most people took for granted. Free spirits had to learn to navigate life using their own judgment rather than relying on external authorities to tell them what to think and feel. The process was often lonely. Society, Nietzsche observed, was generally suspicious of those who thought too independently, who asked too many uncomfortable questions, who refused to accept conventional wisdom without examination. Free spirits often found themselves isolated from their former communities, while not yet having discovered new ones that could understand their perspective. But this isolation, painful as it might be, also created space for authentic self-development. Without the constant pressure to conform to external expectations, free spirits could begin to discover who they really were beneath all the layers of social conditioning. They could start to identify their own genuine interests, values, and aspirations, rather than simply accepting what others had told them they should want. As you settle deeper into rest, let yourself imagine what it might feel like to live with such authenticity. Picture waking up each morning with a clear sense of your own purposes, rather than feeling driven by obligations that don't truly resonate with your deepest self. Envision making choices based on your own carefully considered values, rather than automatic responses programmed by your upbringing or social environment. This wasn't a selfish vision, despite how it might initially sound. Nietzsche believed that people who had learned to be genuinely themselves would naturally become more generous, more creative, more capable of genuine love and friendship. When you weren't constantly struggling against internal conflicts between your authentic nature and imposed expectations, energy was freed up for more positive purposes. The philosopher's own life provided both an example and a cautionary tale about this process. His willingness to think independently had cost him his academic career, his health, and many of his personal relationships. Yet it had also allowed him to create a body of work that would inspire and challenge readers for generations to come. During his most productive years, writing in small Swiss and Italian towns, often in considerable physical discomfort, Nietzsche experienced something he described as a kind of spiritual intoxication. Despite his ailments and isolation, he felt more alive, more creative, more genuinely himself than ever before. His notebooks from this period overflow with insights, observations, and experiments in thinking that sparkle with intellectual joy. He had learned to find meaning not in external validation, but in the process of creation itself. Each book, each aphorism, each carefully crafted sentence was an act of self-expression and self-overcoming. He was living his philosophy, demonstrating that it was possible to forge beauty and meaning from even the most difficult circumstances. But Nietzsche was careful not to present his own path as a universal prescription. The specific form that self-creation takes would be different for each individual. What mattered was not copying his particular solutions but learning the underlying principles, developing the capacity for honest self-examination, creative problem-solving, and courageous authenticity. His vision of human potential was ultimately democratic in a deep sense. He didn't believe that only a few exceptional individuals could achieve self-mastery and creative freedom. Instead, he thought that every person possessed the basic capacities needed for this kind of development, though most had never been encouraged to cultivate them. The tragedy of his age, as he saw it, was not that people were inherently weak or stupid, but that they had been taught to be smaller than they actually were. Religious and moral systems that emphasized humility, obedience, and self-denial had convinced many individuals that their own thoughts and feelings were unreliable, that they needed external authorities to guide them through life. This learned helplessness, Nietzsche argued, was neither natural nor necessary. It was a historical development that could be understood, questioned, and ultimately transcended. People could learn to trust their own judgment, to think that expressed their authentic nature rather than merely conforming critically about inherited beliefs, and to create lives to external expectations. The process required what he called intellectual honesty, the willingness to follow one's reasoning wherever it led, even when the conclusions were uncomfortable or socially unpopular. It also demanded emotional courage, the strength to feel one's authentic responses rather than the responses one had been taught to have. Most challenging of all, it required what Nietzsche termed amor fati, love of one's fate. This meant learning to embrace not just the pleasant aspects of one's life, but also the difficulties, the limitations, even the failures. Instead of wasting energy on resentment about circumstances that couldn't be changed, one could learn to find creative ways to work with whatever life provided. This acceptance wasn't passive resignation, but active engagement, the artist's approach to working with available materials rather than fantasizing about perfect conditions that would never arrive. A sculptor doesn't resent the particular block of marble they've been given. They discover what beautiful form might emerge from its specific grain and texture. As these ideas drift through your consciousness tonight, let them settle gently rather than demanding immediate application. Nietzsche's philosophy was meant to be lived and tested over time, not grasped through intellectual analysis alone. His insights invite experimentation, gradual exploration, patient development, rather than sudden transformation. The solitary figure walking mountain paths was slowly discovering that the death of traditional certainties didn't have to lead to nihilism and despair. It could instead open up space for more authentic, more creative, more fully human ways of being. The old gods might be dying, but in their place, human beings might learn to become gods themselves, not in the sense of gaining supernatural powers, but in developing the capacity for genuine creation, for bringing new forms of meaning and beauty into existence through their own efforts and imagination. But to understand how one might become such a creator, Nietzsche knew he had to venture even deeper into the archaeology of human consciousness. He needed to excavate the buried foundations of our most basic assumptions about right and wrong, to trace the historical roots of our moral instincts back to their origins. This investigation would lead him into what he considered his most important work, a genealogy that would reveal how our current values had been shaped by forces we barely understood. Picture the philosopher in his modest lodgings, surrounded by notebooks filled with observations about human behavior, fragments of insight about the hidden springs of moral judgment. His eyesight was failing, forcing him to write in increasingly large letters, but his vision into the depths of human psychology had never been clearer. He was beginning to see patterns that had remained invisible to centuries of moral philosophers. The key insight that emerged from this investigation was both simple and revolutionary. Our moral categories, those seemingly eternal distinctions between good and evil, hadn't descended from heaven or emerged from pure rational reflection. Instead, they had grown out of very particular historical circumstances, shaped by the needs and perspectives of specific groups of people at specific moments in time. Nietzsche traced what he saw as two fundamental moral genealogies, two different ways that human communities had learned to organize their values and judgments. The first emerged from what he called the noble classes, groups that had achieved positions of strength and independence through their own efforts. Their moral vocabulary naturally reflected their experience of efficacy and self-determination. For these communities, good meant excellent, powerful, beautiful, noble, in the sense of achieving something worthy of admiration. bad simply meant common, low, ineffective, failing to achieve distinction. This wasn't a moral judgment in our modern sense, but more like an aesthetic evaluation. Some things were admirable and some weren't, just as some artworks are beautiful and others mediocre. The second genealogy emerged from very different circumstances. Communities that had experienced powerlessness, oppression, or defeat developed their own moral vocabulary, one that naturally reflected their different relationship to strength and weakness. For them, the powerful became evil, while the powerless became good. Humility replaced pride as a virtue, suffering became more noble than success, and equality became more important than excellence. As you rest in the darkness, consider how these different moral perspectives might still be operating within your own consciousness. When you admire someone, is it primarily for their achievements and capabilities, or for their kindness and humility? When you judge your own actions, do you ask whether they expressed your authentic strength, or whether they conform to universal standards of right behavior? Neither perspective was inherently superior, Nietzsche believed. They were simply different tools, different ways of organizing human community and meaning. But he worried that his own era had become too dominated by the second approach, that people had lost touch with their capacity for genuine self-affirmation and creative expression. The problem wasn't that values like compassion and equality were inherently bad. The problem was that when these values became the only acceptable ones, they could prevent people from developing other crucial capacities like strength, independence, and creative courage. A moral system designed originally to protect the weak could eventually weaken everyone by discouraging the very qualities needed for genuine flourishing. This analysis led Nietzsche to one of his most controversial insights, his critique of what he called the ascetic ideal. Throughout history, he observed, many of the most influential moral and religious systems had been based on a fundamental rejection of life as it actually is. They promised meaning and value, but only at the cost of denying or transcending the natural world, the body, the passions, the creative chaos of existence itself. The ascetic ideal took many forms. It appeared in religious traditions that taught people to despise the flesh and long for a purely spiritual realm. It manifested in philosophical systems that valued abstract reason over lived experience. It showed up in the moral codes that demanded the suppression of natural impulses in favor of universal principles. But Nietzsche saw a deeper pattern beneath all these variations. The ascetic ideal was essentially a way of saying no to life, of finding meaning through rejection rather than affirmation. It promised to solve the problem of suffering by eliminating the conditions that made suffering possible, rather than by learning to transform suffering into something valuable. This approach wasn't necessarily wrong, Nietzsche acknowledged. It had provided meaning and purpose for countless generations of human beings who might otherwise have despaired entirely. The ascetic ideal had been a kind of medicine for the sick, a way of making existence bearable for those who couldn't find any other source of value. But like any medicine, it came with side effects. Prolonged reliance on life-denying values could gradually drain people of their natural vitality, their capacity for joy, their willingness to take creative risks. They might achieve a kind of peace, but at the cost of becoming pale shadows of what they might have been. In his notebooks from this period, Nietzsche experimented with imagining what a life-affirming alternative might look like. What if, instead of seeking meaning through denial and transcendence, people learned to find it through deeper engagement with existence as it is? What if suffering could be transformed into strength, limitation into creativity, even failure into wisdom? This wasn't simply a matter of positive thinking or superficial optimism. It required what Nietzsche called a fundamental reorientation of the will, a shift from seeking meaning outside of life to creating meaning within it. Instead of asking what external authority could validate their choices, people would learn to ask what choices would best express their authentic nature and creative potential. The shift sounded simple in theory, but Nietzsche knew it would be extraordinarily difficult in practice. Generations of conditioning had taught most people to look outside themselves for guidance about what to think, feel, and value. Learning to trust one's own judgment, to create one's own purposes, to take full responsibility for one's choices, required a kind of courage that few had ever been encouraged to develop. During his long walks through the Italian countryside, where he spent many of his most productive years, Nietzsche began to envision what he called a new nobility, not based on birth or wealth, but on spiritual achievement. These would be individuals who had learned to create their own values, to find meaning through their own efforts, to affirm life fully without needing external validation or consolation. Such people wouldn't be perfect or invulnerable. They would still face difficulties, limitations, failures, and suffering. But they would have learned to work with these challenges creatively rather than being defeated by them. They would have developed what he called a great health, not the absence of problems, but the strength to transform problems into opportunities for growth and self-expression. The path to this kind of spiritual nobility required what Nietzsche described as a long discipline of the spirit, a gradual process of self-examination, experimentation, and refinement. It couldn't be achieved through sudden conversion or dramatic revelation, but only through patient, sustained effort over many years. The first stage involved what he called the camel, the capacity to bear heavy burdens without complaint. This wasn't passive resignation, but active acceptance of responsibility, the willingness to carry the weight of one's circumstances without immediately seeking to escape or blame others. Like a camel crossing the desert, one learned to endure difficulties while continuing to move forward. The second stage he symbolized as the lion, the development of critical strength and independence. Lions could say no to inherited values that no longer served them, could break free from external authorities that had kept them dependent. This was often a necessary but destructive phase, clearing away old structures without yet having built new ones to replace them. The final stage was the child, the recovery of creative spontaneity and the capacity for new beginnings. Children could play with possibilities, experiment with different ways of being, create meaning through their own activity rather than inheriting it from others. They represented the highest human potential, not because they were naive, but because they had learned to be genuinely themselves. As these images settle into your consciousness, let them serve as gentle markers rather than demanding goals. Nietzsche's philosophy was never meant to be a program that everyone should follow identically. Instead, it was an invitation to begin one's own process of self-examination and creative development, using whatever materials and circumstances life had provided. The philosopher himself never claimed to have fully achieved the ideal he described. His writings were full of contradictions, uncertainties, and ongoing struggles with his own limitations. But this honesty about his incomplete development was part of his appeal. He wasn't offering a finished system, but sharing the process of philosophical growth itself. His concept of eternal recurrence emerged from this period of intense self-reflection. If you had to live your exact life over again, infinitely, would you be able to embrace that repetition with joy? The question wasn't meant to be answered quickly, but to serve as a kind of spiritual exercise, a way of testing the depth of your life affirmation. Someone who could genuinely welcome eternal recurrence would be someone who had learned to find meaning and value, even in difficult experiences, who had developed the capacity to transform suffering into wisdom, limitation into creativity. They wouldn't love their life because it was easy or perfect, but because it was theirs, because they had learned to make something beautiful from whatever materials existence had provided. This test of eternal recurrence wasn't masochistic or pessimistic, despite its challenging implications. It was actually profoundly optimistic, based on the conviction that human beings possessed far greater creative capacity than most ever realized. If people could learn to embrace even their mistakes and failures as necessary parts of their development, they would be free to live with unprecedented authenticity and courage. The vision that emerged from these investigations was both inspiring and daunting. Human beings didn't have to remain prisoners of inherited values that no longer served their growth. They could learn to become artists of their own existence, creators of meaning rather than merely consumers of it. But this freedom came with tremendous responsibility, the weight of having to choose without external guarantees about what choices were correct. Nietzsche saw this responsibility not as a burden, but as an opportunity, perhaps the greatest opportunity that had ever been offered to human consciousness. For the first time in history, he believed, conditions were developing that might allow significant numbers of people to achieve genuine spiritual independence and creative self-expression. The old authorities, religious and secular, were losing their power to compel automatic obedience. Traditional moral systems were being questioned by thoughtful individuals who noticed their historical contingency. Scientific understanding was revealing the natural origins of phenomena that had once seemed supernatural. All of these developments could be experienced as threatening, as a loss of comforting certainties, but they could also be experienced as liberating, as the clearing away of obstacles to authentic self-development. The question was whether people would have the courage to seize this opportunity, or would retreat into new forms of dependency and conformity. As you drift toward deeper rest, carry with you this image of human potential, not as a fixed destination, but as an ongoing process of creative self-development. The philosopher walking those mountain paths had discovered that the collapse of traditional certainties didn't have to lead to despair. It could instead open up space for more authentic, more creative, more fully human ways of being in the world. The journey beyond good and evil wasn't a destination, but a direction, a way of approaching life with curiosity rather than rigid judgment, with creative engagement rather than passive acceptance. It required tremendous courage and patience, but it offered in return the possibility of becoming genuinely oneself, of creating beauty and meaning through one's own efforts and imagination. Tonight, as Nietzsche's insights settle into your consciousness like seeds in fertile soil, remember that his philosophy was never meant to be grasped through intellectual understanding alone. It was an invitation to experimentation, to gradual exploration, to patient development of capacities that most people never knew they possessed. The restless spirit who challenged the foundations of Western morality was ultimately offering a gift, the possibility of genuine freedom and authentic self-expression. But like all valuable gifts, it came with responsibilities, the obligation to think carefully, to choose consciously, and to create meaning through one's own efforts rather than simply inheriting it from others. The philosopher's most radical insight was still taking shape as he wandered those quiet alpine paths, his mind turning over questions that would eventually revolutionize how we think about human potential. In the gathering dusk of traditional certainties, he was beginning to glimpse something extraordinary, the possibility that human beings might not need external authorities to tell them how to live at all. This realization didn't come as a sudden flash of enlightenment, but as a gradual dawning, like sunrise spreading slowly across a mountain valley. Nietzsche was discovering that what most people called conscience might not be the voice of universal moral law, but rather an internalized collection of social rules, parental commands, and cultural expectations that had been absorbed so early in life that they felt like natural instincts. If this were true, then the voice that whispered, "you should," or "you must not," wasn't delivering messages from some transcendent realm of absolute truth. It was simply replaying recordings made by other human beings, perhaps well-meaning but ultimately limited individuals who had their own particular perspectives, fears, and agendas. The implications were both thrilling and terrifying. If moral intuitions were indeed learned rather than discovered, then they could potentially be unlearned, examined, and consciously reconstructed. People might be far freer than they had ever imagined, but they would also be far more responsible for the consequences of their choices. Picture Nietzsche sitting beside a mountain stream, watching water flow around rocks and fallen branches, adapting its course to whatever obstacles it encountered, while never losing its essential nature as water. Perhaps, he thought, human beings could learn to live with similar fluid intelligence, responding creatively to circumstances while remaining true to their deepest nature. But what was that deepest nature? This question would occupy him for years, leading him through labyrinthine investigations into psychology, history, and the hidden springs of human motivation. He began to suspect that beneath all the layers of social conditioning, religious indoctrination, and moral training lay something far more interesting than the conventional wisdom suggested. Most philosophical and religious traditions had taught that human nature was fundamentally flawed, requiring constant surveillance and correction by external authorities. People were supposedly prone to selfishness, violence, and chaos, unless properly disciplined by law, custom, and moral education. This assumption had justified centuries of authoritarian control, both political and spiritual. But Nietzsche was beginning to wonder whether this supposed need for control might actually be creating the very problems it claimed to solve. What if human beings weren't naturally destructive, but had simply been taught to distrust their own instincts? What if the capacity for creativity, compassion, and wisdom existed naturally within people, but had been suppressed by systems that feared spontaneity and independence? As you rest tonight, let this possibility settle gently in your consciousness. Consider the moments in your own life when you felt most alive, most genuinely yourself. Were these times when you were carefully following external rules and expectations, or were they moments when you trusted your own judgment, followed your authentic interests, expressed your creative nature? Nietzsche's investigations led him to distinguish between what he called active and reactive approaches to life. Active individuals created their own goals, pursued their own visions, responded to challenges with creativity and determination. They didn't spend much energy comparing themselves to others or seeking external validation for their choices. Reactive individuals, by contrast, define themselves primarily in opposition to others or in response to external demands. They might achieve conventional success and social approval, but their achievements felt hollow because they emerged from compliance rather than authentic self-expression. Their energy was consumed by managing impressions and meeting expectations rather than creating something genuinely their own. Neither approach was inherently superior in all circumstances, but Nietzsche worried that his culture was producing too many reactive individuals, people who had learned to be so concerned with others' opinions that they had lost touch with their own authentic desires and capabilities. This concern led him to examine what he called the herd instinct, the powerful human tendency to seek safety through conformity with group norms. The herd instinct had obvious survival value in primitive conditions where isolation could mean death, but in more complex civilizations it might actually become counterproductive, preventing the kind of independent thinking and creative risk-taking that could solve new problems or create new possibilities. During his solitary evening walks through Italian hill towns, Nietzsche began to envision what he called free spirits, individuals who had learned to think independently without becoming isolated or antisocial. These wouldn't be rebels who rejected all social connection, but people who could participate in community while maintaining their intellectual and creative autonomy. Free spirits would be genuinely curious about different perspectives rather than defensive about their own beliefs. They would be willing to experiment with new ideas, new ways of living, new approaches to old problems. Most importantly, they would have developed the strength to be alone with themselves, to find meaning and purpose through their own reflection and creativity, rather than depending entirely on social validation. The path to such freedom required what Nietzsche called philosophical courage, the willingness to question even one's most cherished assumptions. This wasn't the courage of physical heroism, but something perhaps more difficult. The courage to think honestly even when honest thinking led to uncomfortable conclusions. Most people, he observed, preferred comfortable illusions to difficult truths. They would rather maintain beliefs that made them feel good about themselves and their world than examine whether those beliefs actually corresponded to reality. This preference for comfort over truth wasn't necessarily a character flaw. It was a natural human tendency that required conscious effort to overcome. But those who developed the capacity for philosophical courage might discover something remarkable. Behind many of their fears and limitations lay not genuine obstacles, but merely assumptions that had never been properly examined. What they had taken to be natural laws might turn out to be temporary conventions. What they had accepted as their fixed nature might prove to be malleable patterns that could be gradually transformed. As these ideas drift through your awareness, let them rest without demanding immediate application. Nietzsche's philosophy was designed to unfold slowly, like a complex piece of music that reveals new melodies with each listening. The insights that might seem abstract tonight could become practical wisdom through patient reflection and gentle experimentation. The philosopher's investigation into human potential led him to examine what he called the phenomenon of sublimation, the process by which raw drives and impulses could be transformed into higher forms of expression. Instead of simply suppressing difficult emotions or destructive impulses, one could learn to redirect their energy toward creative purposes. Anger, for instance, might be sublimated into passionate advocacy for justice. Sexual energy might be channeled into artistic creation. Even destructive impulses might be transformed into the kind of creative destruction that cleared away outdated ideas to make room for new insights. This process required what Nietzsche called spiritual discipline, not the harsh self-denial practiced by ascetic traditions, but a more nuanced approach that worked with natural energies rather than against them. Like a skilled gardener who knew how to prune plants to encourage healthy growth, the spiritually disciplined individual learned to shape their impulses without destroying their vitality. The goal wasn't to become perfect or to eliminate all difficult emotions, but to develop the capacity for what he called higher men and women, individuals who had learned to transform their raw material of personality into something beautiful and meaningful. This wasn't a matter of following predetermined rules, but of discovering through experimentation what forms of expression best served one's authentic nature. During his most creative periods, writing in small rooms overlooking the Mediterranean, Nietzsche experienced what he described as a kind of intoxication, a state of heightened awareness and creative flow that seemed to emerge when he stopped trying to control his thoughts and instead learned to dance with them. These experiences convinced him that human consciousness possessed capacities that were rarely accessed in ordinary states of mind. People might be capable of far more creativity, insight, and joy than they typically experienced, but accessing these capacities required learning to trust their own instincts and to work with their natural rhythms rather than against them. He began to speak of what he called the dancing star, his metaphor for the kind of creative individual who had learned to find meaning through their own movement, rather than seeking it in fixed external structures. Dancing stars weren't chaotic or undisciplined, they had simply learned to find order through dynamic balance rather than static rigidity. This vision of human potential was both inspiring and demanding. It suggested that people might be capable of creating their own purposes, their own values, their own forms of meaning and beauty. But it also implied that such creation required tremendous responsibility. The obligation to think carefully, choose consciously, and accept the consequences of one's decisions without blaming external authorities. The philosopher's health continued to deteriorate during these years of intense creativity, but his intellectual vitality seemed to grow stronger in inverse proportion to his physical weakness. He was learning to extract maximum meaning from minimal resources, to find joy in small pleasures, to create beauty from whatever materials life provided. His notebooks from this period overflow with observations about the subtle art of living well under difficult circumstances. He was discovering that happiness might not depend primarily on external conditions, but on one's approach to whatever conditions existed. This wasn't mere positive thinking, but a deeper understanding of how consciousness could be shaped through practice and attention. He began to experiment with what he called voluntary fate, the practice of choosing to want what was already happening rather than wasting energy on resentment about circumstances that couldn't be changed. This didn't mean passive acceptance of injustice or abandonment of efforts to improve conditions, but rather a strategic focus on areas where one's energy could be most effectively applied. Someone practicing voluntary fate might still work to change problematic situations, but they would do so from a position of strength rather than victimhood, creativity rather than resentment. They would have learned to find meaning in the process of engagement itself, rather than depending entirely on external results for validation. As you settle deeper into rest, let yourself imagine what it might feel like to approach your own challenges with such creative engagement. Picture waking up tomorrow with a sense of curiosity about what possibilities might emerge from your current circumstances, regardless of how difficult those circumstances might appear on the surface. Nietzsche's vision of self-creation wasn't meant to be a solitary project. He believed that individuals who had learned to be genuinely themselves would naturally become more capable of authentic friendship and love. When people weren't constantly struggling against internal conflicts between their authentic nature and imposed expectations, energy was freed up for more generous forms of relationship. The philosopher's own experience of isolation was partly a result of his historical circumstances, living in an era when few people were ready to explore the kind of radical freedom he was describing. But he envisioned future communities of free spirits who could support each other's growth while respecting each other's independence. Such communities wouldn't be based on shared beliefs or identical values, but on mutual appreciation for the creative process itself. Members would be united not by what they thought, but by how they thought, not by their conclusions, but by their commitment to honest inquiry and authentic self-expression. This vision pointed toward what Nietzsche called a transvaluation of values, not the replacement of old values with new ones, but the development of a completely different relationship to the process of valuation itself. Instead of seeking the correct values that everyone should adopt, people might learn to ask what values would best serve their own authentic development and creative expression. The question wasn't whether particular values were objectively true or false, but whether they were alive or dead, growth-promoting or growth-inhibiting for specific individuals in particular circumstances. This approach required tremendous sophistication and self-knowledge, the capacity to distinguish between authentic desires and conditioned responses, between creative impulses and reactive patterns. During long afternoons in Italian piazzas, watching people go about their daily lives, Nietzsche reflected on the tragedy of unrealized potential he saw everywhere around him. Most people, he believed, were living far smaller lives than they needed to, constrained not by external circumstances but by internal limitations they had never learned to question. But he also saw signs of hope, moments when individuals broke through their conditioning to express something genuinely their own. A street musician lost in the joy of creation, a child absorbed in imaginative play, lovers discovering new depths of connection, artists risking failure to bring their visions to life. These glimpses convinced him that the capacity for creative self-expression existed naturally within human consciousness, but required specific conditions to flourish. Like plants that needed the right combination of soil, water, and sunlight, human creativity needed freedom from excessive external control, opportunities for experimentation, and communities that valued authentic expression over mere conformity. The philosopher's investigation into these conditions led him to examine what he called the genealogy of the free spirit, tracing the historical circumstances that had occasionally allowed such individuals to emerge. He found that periods of cultural transition, when old certainties were breaking down but new authorities hadn't yet solidified, often produced remarkable flowering of human creativity and independence. Perhaps his own era, for all its apparent nihilism and confusion, might actually be such a transitional period. The old gods were indeed dying, but in their death throes they might be clearing space for something unprecedented. The emergence of human beings who had learned to be their own gods, not in the sense of claiming supernatural powers, but in developing the capacity for genuine creation, for bringing new forms of meaning and beauty into existence through their own efforts and imagination. As these possibilities settle into your consciousness tonight, let them serve as gentle invitations rather than demanding programs. Nietzsche's philosophy was never meant to be implemented immediately or completely, but to be explored gradually, tested through small experiments in thinking and living differently. The solitary figure walking those mountain paths had discovered something that might transform how human beings understood their own nature and potential. But the discovery was still unfolding, still revealing new dimensions and implications that would require generations of thoughtful individuals to fully explore and develop. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you carry with you the philosopher's gift, the possibility that you might be far freer, far more creative, far more capable of authentic joy than you have ever been taught to believe. The journey beyond good and evil continues, not as a destination to be reached, but as a direction to be explored, step by patient step, breath by mindful breath, toward the full flowering of human possibility. The afternoon light filtered through the shutters of Nietzsche's modest lodgings in the Italian village, where he had taken refuge from both the harsh alpine winters and the equally harsh judgments of academic society. His eyesight was failing more each day, forcing him to rely on friends and secretaries to transcribe his thoughts, but his inner vision had never been clearer. During these quiet hours, when the physical world grew dim, the landscapes of consciousness seemed to open before him with unprecedented clarity. It was during this period of enforced stillness that some of his most profound insights began to crystallize. Unable to take his customary long walks, he turned inward, exploring the territories of memory, imagination, and possibility with the same methodical patience he had once applied to ancient Greek texts. What he discovered there would revolutionize not just philosophy, but our understanding of what it means to be human. Picture the philosopher sitting by his window, listening to the sounds of village life below, the voices of children playing, merchants calling their wares, church bells marking the hours. This ordinary human symphony became for him a kind of music, each voice representing a different way of being in the world, each life a unique experiment in the art of existence. As you rest tonight, let yourself sink into that same quality of gentle observation. Notice how your own consciousness moves between different states, different ways of attending to experience. There's no need to judge or direct these movements, simply observe them with the same curious patience that Nietzsche brought to his investigations of human nature. During these contemplative afternoons, he began to develop what would become one of his most practical and transformative insights, the understanding that consciousness itself could be cultivated like a skill. Most people, he realized, lived their entire lives without ever questioning the particular patterns of attention, emotion, and judgment that had been shaped by their early experiences. They experienced their thoughts and feelings as simply happening to them, like weather patterns beyond their control. But what if consciousness was actually more malleable than most people assumed? What if the very quality of one's inner life could be gradually refined through patient practice and careful attention? This wasn't a mystical teaching, but a practical observation based on his own experiments with different ways of thinking and feeling. He noticed that when he approached his physical pain with curiosity rather than resistance, it became more bearable. When he observed his lonely moments with compassion rather than self-pity, they transformed into opportunities for deeper self-understanding. The key insight was that suffering itself wasn't the problem. The problem was unconscious suffering, pain that was experienced without meaning, difficulty that led to nothing but more difficulty. But conscious suffering, pain that was embraced as part of a larger process of growth and self-creation, could become a source of strength and wisdom. Nietzsche began to see that what most people called happiness was actually a rather shallow and temporary state, dependent on external circumstances that were largely beyond their control. But what he called joy was something deeper and more sustainable, arising from the process of authentic self-expression, regardless of whether that expression was immediately rewarded by the world. A musician might experience joy in the act of creating music even if no one listened. A thinker might find deep satisfaction in following a difficult line of reasoning, even if it led to unpopular conclusions. A lover might discover meaning in the very capacity to love deeply, even if that love wasn't returned in the way they hoped. This distinction between happiness and joy became central to his mature philosophy. Happiness depended on getting what you wanted, but joy emerged from wanting what you were already doing, from finding meaning in the process of engagement itself rather than only in its results. As these ideas settle into your consciousness, let yourself consider the activities in your own life that generate this deeper kind of satisfaction. Perhaps there are things you do not because they bring immediate pleasure or external reward, but because they express something essential about who you are. These moments of authentic engagement might be glimpses of what Nietzsche called the eternal yes, the fundamental life affirmation that could transform even difficult circumstances into opportunities for creative response. During his most productive hours, usually in the early morning when his physical symptoms were less severe, Nietzsche experienced what he described as a kind of writing intoxication. The words seemed to flow through him rather than from him, as if he were serving as a channel for insights that existed somewhere beyond his conscious control. This experience convinced him that creativity wasn't simply a matter of personal will or individual talent, but of learning to cooperate with forces that were larger than the conscious ego. The most profound insights seemed to arise when he stopped trying to think and instead learned to listen to the deeper currents of his own consciousness. He began to understand that what people called inspiration wasn't a rare gift bestowed on a chosen few, but a natural capacity that could be cultivated through proper preparation and receptive attention. Like a gardener who couldn't force plants to grow but could create conditions that encouraged growth, the creative individual learned to prepare the soil of consciousness and then wait patiently for new insights to emerge. This required what he called active passivity, a state of alert receptiveness that was neither forcing nor lazy. It was the mental equivalent of a cat watching a mouse hole, completely relaxed yet totally ready to spring into action when the moment was right. The practice of active passivity became one of Nietzsche's most important personal disciplines. Instead of struggling against his limitations, he learned to work with them creatively. His poor eyesight forced him to develop his memory and his capacity for sustained mental concentration. His social isolation freed him from the constant pressure to conform to others' expectations, allowing his authentic voice to emerge more clearly. Even his physical pain, which had once seemed like nothing but an obstacle to productive work, began to serve as a kind of teacher. It forced him to be extremely selective about how he used his limited energy, to distinguish between what was truly important and what was merely conventional or habitual. During the long afternoons when pain made concentrated work impossible, he practiced what he called the art of forgetting. Instead of dwelling on his discomfort or frustration, he learned to let his attention drift into what he described as a kind of waking dream state, allowing his mind to make unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated ideas. These periods of apparent idleness often proved to be among his most creatively fertile times. Solutions to philosophical problems would suddenly appear, new ways of understanding old questions would crystallize, fresh metaphors would emerge that could illuminate concepts he had been struggling to express clearly. The experience taught him that the conscious, goal-directed mind was only one instrument in the orchestra of human intelligence. There were other forms of knowing that operated according to different rhythms, other ways of processing information that couldn't be rushed or commanded but only invited and received. This insight led him to develop what he called a philosophy of the afternoon, a way of thinking that was more playful and experimental than the systematic approaches favoured by most academic philosophers. Instead of trying to build complete theoretical systems, he preferred to explore ideas through what he called philosophical experiments, trying on different perspectives to see what new possibilities they might reveal. Like an artist sketching different poses of the same model, he would approach the same philosophical question from multiple angles, each investigation revealing aspects that hadn't been visible from other viewpoints. This method required tremendous intellectual humility, the willingness to hold one's conclusions lightly and remain open to new evidence or alternative interpretations. But it also generated a kind of intellectual excitement that the more rigid approaches lacked. Each day brought the possibility of genuine discovery, of seeing familiar questions in completely new ways. Philosophy became less like building a monument and more like exploring an unmapped territory where every turn in the path might reveal unexpected vistas. As you drift deeper into rest, let yourself adopt something of this experimental attitude toward your own thoughts and experiences. Instead of immediately categorizing things as good or bad, right or wrong, try simply observing them with curious attention. What new aspects might become visible if you approached familiar experiences from slightly different angles? Nietzsche's afternoon philosophy led him to examine what he called the prejudices of philosophers, the unexamined assumptions that shaped how most thinkers approached their work. One of the deepest prejudices, he believed, was the assumption that truth was something static and eternal, waiting to be discovered like a hidden treasure. But what if truth was actually something more dynamic and creative? What if the most important truths weren't found but made, not discovered but created through the very process of sincere inquiry? This possibility suggested that philosophy might be less like archaeology and more like art, less about uncovering pre-existing facts and more about bringing new possibilities into being. This perspective transformed his understanding of his own philosophical work. Instead of trying to prove that his insights were objectively correct for all people at all times, he began to present them as experiments in thinking and living that others might try for themselves if they found them intriguing. He started to think of his books less as definitive statements, and more as invitations to join him in the process of exploration. His readers weren't supposed to accept his conclusions uncritically, but to use his investigations as starting points for their own philosophical adventures. This approach required a different kind of courage than the traditional philosophical stance of claiming absolute certainty. It meant accepting that his insights might be wrong, incomplete, or useful only for certain types of people in specific circumstances. But it also opened up possibilities for genuine dialogue and collaborative inquiry that the more authoritarian approaches foreclosed. During his evening walks through the narrow streets of Italian hill towns, Nietzsche would often reflect on the ordinary people he encountered, wondering what unexpressed potentials might lie dormant within them. The baker kneading bread with unconscious artistry, the mother singing lullabies to her child, the old men playing chess in the piazza, all seemed to contain hints of creative capacities that their circumstances had never allowed them to fully develop. This observation led him to one of his most democratic insights, the recognition that the capacity for philosophical thinking wasn't limited to professional academics or intellectual elites. Every human being, he believed, possessed the basic equipment needed for deep reflection about the meaning and purpose of their existence. What most people lacked wasn't intelligence or curiosity, but simply permission to think for themselves, encouragement to trust their own observations and insights, rather than deferring automatically to external authorities. The tragedy wasn't that most people were incapable of wisdom, but that they had. This realization filled him with both been taught to believe they were incapable. Sadness and hope. Sadness for all the unrealized potential he saw around him, the creative energies that were being wasted through conformity and self-doubt, but also hope that conditions might eventually develop that would allow more people to access their natural capacities for authentic self-expression and creative thought. He began to envision what he called a democratization of nobility, not the elimination of excellence, but its extension to include forms of achievement that the traditional aristocratic cultures had overlooked or undervalued. Perhaps the baker who brought genuine artistry to his work was as noble in his own way as the philosopher who brought clarity to difficult questions. This vision required a fundamental shift in how society understood and valued human achievement. Instead of recognizing only certain predetermined forms of success, communities might learn to appreciate the countless ways that individuals could express their authentic nature and contribute something unique to the human conversation. The mother who raised her children with genuine wisdom, the craftsman who took pride in the quality of his work, the friend who offered honest companionship in difficult times, all might be understood as participating in the great human project of creating meaning and beauty from the raw materials of existence. As these possibilities drift through your awareness, let them rest without demanding immediate application. Nietzsche's insights were designed to work slowly, like seeds planted in consciousness that would sprout and grow according to their own natural rhythms. During his most reflective moments, usually in the quiet hours before dawn when the world seemed suspended between night and day, the philosopher would return to what he considered his most important question, not "what should I believe?" or "how should I live?" but "who am I becoming through the choices I make and the attention I give?" This question shifted the focus from abstract principles to lived experience, from external standards to internal development. It suggested that the most important philosophical work happened not in the mind alone, but in the daily process of becoming more authentically oneself, through conscious choice and creative response to circumstances. The question also implied that identity wasn't fixed but fluid, not a problem to be solved once and for all, but an ongoing creative project that would continue as long as consciousness itself continued. Each day brought new opportunities to express one's authentic nature more clearly, to develop capacities that had remained dormant, to discover aspects of oneself that had never been explored. This understanding transformed his relationship to his own limitations and failures. Instead of seeing them as evidence of inadequacy, he began to view them as information about areas where further development was possible. Mistakes became teachers, difficulties became invitations to discover new strengths. Even his philosophical errors became stepping stones toward deeper understanding. The shift wasn't easy or automatic. Years of conditioning had taught him to judge himself harshly, to see limitations as shameful rather than instructive. But gradually, through patient practice, he learned to approach his own development with the same curious compassion he had learned to bring to his philosophical investigations. As you settle into the deepest layers of rest, carry with you this gentle question that occupied so much of Nietzsche's attention, not as a demand for immediate answers, but as a quiet companion to your own ongoing process of becoming. Who are you becoming through the choices you make, the attention you give, the ways you respond to whatever life presents? The question doesn't require heroic answers or dramatic transformations. It simply invites awareness, the kind of gentle self-observation that makes conscious growth possible. In the morning, you might notice small choices that express your authentic nature more clearly. In moments of difficulty, you might discover strengths you hadn't known you possessed. The philosopher's journey beyond good and evil wasn't a destination, but a direction, a way of approaching life with curiosity rather than rigid judgment, with creative engagement rather than passive acceptance. It offered the possibility of becoming genuinely free, not from all constraints, but from the unconscious patterns that prevented authentic self-expression. Tonight, as his insights settle into the quiet spaces of your consciousness, remember that this freedom isn't something to be achieved once and for all, but something to be practiced moment by moment, choice by choice, breath by breath. The restless spirit who challenged the foundations of Western thought was ultimately offering a gift, the possibility of discovering who you truly are beneath all the layers of conditioning and expectation. The mountain paths still wind through the landscapes of consciousness, still invite exploration by those brave enough to venture beyond the familiar territories of inherited belief. The philosopher who walked those paths has long since completed his journey, but the paths themselves remain, patient and eternal, waiting for each new traveller to discover what lies beyond good and evil, in the creative heart of authentic human existence. The setting sun cast long shadows across the Italian countryside, as Nietzsche entered what would prove to be his most productive and transformative period. His physical decline had accelerated, but paradoxically his philosophical vision had never been sharper. It was as if the weakening of his body had concentrated all his energy into pure thought, pure creative fire that burned with increasing intensity despite the frailty of its vessel. During these twilight years of his active intellectual life, he began to synthesize the insights that had been accumulating through decades of solitary reflection. The fragments and aphorisms that filled his notebook started to coalesce into a coherent vision of human possibility that was both deeply personal and universally applicable. He was no longer simply criticizing the old values, he was beginning to articulate what might replace them. Picture him in his sparse quarters, surrounded by stacks of paper covered with his increasingly large handwriting, dictating passages to whoever happened to be available to transcribe his thoughts. The urgency was palpable now. Time was running short, and there was still so much to say, so many connections to make explicit, so many implications of his discoveries to explore. As you settle deeper into rest tonight, let yourself imagine the quality of attention that must have filled those rooms. Every word mattered, every insight had to be captured before it slipped away, every moment of clarity was precious beyond measure. There's something almost sacred about creativity pursued under such conditions, when physical limitation strips away everything non-essential and leaves only the pure flame of authentic expression. It was during this period that Nietzsche began to articulate more clearly what he meant by the creation of values. This wasn't the arbitrary invention of personal preferences or the selfish pursuit of individual desire. Instead, it was something far more subtle and demanding. The conscious cultivation of those aspects of human nature that served life, growth, and authentic flourishing. The process began with what he called a ruthless inventory of one's inherited beliefs and automatic responses. Like a merchant taking stock of their warehouse, the aspiring value creator had to examine each moral assumption, each emotional pattern, each habitual way of thinking and feeling, to determine whether it was still serving its intended purpose. Some inherited values might prove to be genuinely life-enhancing, worthy of preservation and conscious cultivation. The capacity for genuine compassion, for instance, or the appreciation of beauty, or the courage to face difficulty without flinching. These weren't to be discarded simply because they had been taught by others, but rather to be understood more deeply and expressed more authentically. Other inherited patterns might reveal themselves as obstacles to growth, defense mechanisms that had once been necessary, but had outlived their usefulness. The tendency to seek approval at the expense of honest self-expression, for example, or the habit of avoiding challenges to preserve a sense of safety that was ultimately illusory. The most difficult cases were those values that contained both life-enhancing and life-diminishing elements, mixed blessings that required careful discernment to separate the wheat from the chaff. Traditional concepts of duty, for instance, might include both a healthy sense of responsibility and an unhealthy suppression of individual creativity. As these considerations drift through your consciousness, let them rest lightly rather than demanding immediate resolution. The process Nietzsche was describing typically unfolded over years, not moments. It required the kind of patient self-observation that deepens naturally with practice, like the way your eyes gradually adjust to darkness, revealing details that were invisible in the initial moments. The philosopher's investigation into value creation led him to examine what he considered one of the most crucial human capacities, the ability to say yes and no with genuine conviction. Most people, he observed, had learned to say yes and no automatically, based on social conditioning rather than authentic discernment. They approved of things they were supposed to approve of and rejected things they were supposed to reject, without ever developing the capacity to evaluate for themselves what truly served their deepest interests. But genuine value creation required what he called sovereign decision-making, the ability to choose based on one's own carefully considered judgment, rather than external pressure or internal compulsion. This wasn't selfishness in the ordinary sense, because truly sovereign individuals had learned to consider the full range of consequences that flowed from their choices, including their effects on others and on their own long-term development. The sovereign individual had developed what Nietzsche described as a long will, the capacity to pursue goals that might not yield immediate gratification, but served larger purposes that unfolded over extended periods. They could delay pleasure when delay served growth, accept discomfort when discomfort led to strength, make sacrifices when those sacrifices contributed to something genuinely worthwhile. This long will wasn't the grim determination of someone forcing themselves to do things they hated, but rather the patient persistence of someone who had found purposes that aligned with their deepest nature. Like a master craftsman who could work for hours on a single detail because they loved the process itself, not just the finished product, the sovereign individual found meaning in the journey rather than depending entirely on the destination for validation. During his evening contemplations, as the last light faded from his window and the village settled into its nightly rhythm, Nietzsche would often reflect on what he called the economy of the soul. Just as a wise merchant understood the flow of resources through their business, the psychologically sophisticated individual learned to track the movement of energy, attention, and emotion through their inner life. This wasn't a matter of rigid self-control or mechanical efficiency, but of developing the kind of sensitivity to internal rhythms that allowed for optimal use of available resources. When was creative energy naturally highest? What kinds of activities depleted vitality unnecessarily? How could difficult emotions be processed in ways that led to wisdom, rather than simply being suppressed or indulged? The goal wasn't to eliminate all waste or difficulty, which would be both impossible and undesirable, but to ensure that the energy invested in struggle was yielding genuine returns in terms of growth, understanding, or creative expression. Some difficulties were genuinely worthwhile, serving as the friction necessary to develop strength and skill. Others were merely habitual, repetitive patterns that consumed energy without producing any meaningful development. Learning to distinguish between these two types of difficulty became one of the most practical applications of Nietzsche's philosophical insights. The person who had developed this discrimination could embrace challenges that served their authentic development, while learning to avoid or minimize those that were merely draining. As you rest tonight, let yourself consider your own relationship to effort and difficulty. Are there areas of your life where you invest considerable energy without seeing corresponding returns in terms of growth or satisfaction? Conversely, are there challenges you avoid that might actually serve your deepest development if approached with courage and skill? The philosopher's exploration of these questions led him to formulate what he considered one of his most important practical insights, the principle of selective attention. Human consciousness, he realized, had a limited capacity for focused awareness. Where that attention was directed determined not only what was noticed, but also what developed and grew stronger over time. Most people, he observed, had never learned to manage their attention consciously. They allowed it to be captured by whatever seemed most urgent or emotionally compelling in the moment, without considering whether that focus served their long-term interests. They worried about things they couldn't control, spent mental energy on resentments that changed nothing, or became absorbed in distractions that provided temporary pleasure but no lasting satisfaction. But attention could be cultivated like any other skill. Through patient practice, one could learn to direct awareness more consciously, to focus on aspects of experience that promoted growth and well-being, rather than being pulled constantly toward whatever seemed most dramatic or immediate. This didn't mean ignoring problems or living in denial about difficulties. It meant developing the capacity to address challenges from a position of strength rather than being overwhelmed by them, to respond rather than merely react, to maintain some degree of conscious choice about where mental and emotional energy was invested. The practice of selective attention became one of Nietzsche's most valued personal disciplines during his difficult final years. Instead of dwelling on his physical limitations or social isolation, he learned to focus on whatever remained possible for creative expression and meaningful engagement. Each day might be limited in scope, but within those limitations lay opportunities for authentic self-expression and continued growth. This shift in attention transformed his relationship to his circumstances. The same external conditions that might have led to despair became occasions for discovering new forms of resilience and creativity. Physical weakness revealed mental strengths he hadn't known he possessed. Social isolation created space for depths of self-understanding that might never have emerged in busier circumstances. The transformation wasn't magical or immediate. It required the same kind of patient practice that any skill development demands. But gradually, through consistent application, he found that his capacity for finding meaning and even joy in difficult circumstances continued to expand, regardless of how challenging the external situation became. During his most reflective moments, usually in the pre-dawn hours when the world was still and quiet, Nietzsche would return to what he considered the deepest question of his mature philosophy. What did it mean to become who one truly was? This wasn't a matter of discovering some fixed, pre-existing identity waiting to be uncovered, but of gradually developing the capacity for authentic self-expression that honoured both one's unique nature and one's connections to the larger human community. The process required what he called psychological archaeology, the patient excavation of one's authentic responses from beneath the layers of conditioning, expectation, and habitual reaction that accumulated over a lifetime. Like an archaeologist carefully brushing dust from ancient artifacts, the sincere seeker had to distinguish between what was genuinely their own and what had simply been absorbed from their environment. This work couldn't be rushed or forced. Authentic self-knowledge emerged gradually, through sustained attention to the subtle differences between responses that felt genuine and those that felt automatic or performed. The capacity for such discrimination developed slowly, like a musician's ear for pitch or a painter's eye for colour, through patient practice and careful observation. But the rewards of this archaeological work were profound. As authentic responses became clearer and stronger, decision-making became less conflicted and more confident. Energy that had been consumed by internal battles between competing voices could be redirected toward creative expression and meaningful engagement with the world. The person who had learned to access their authentic responses didn't become perfect or immune to difficulty. They still faced challenges, made mistakes, experienced disappointment and loss. But they faced these experiences as themselves rather than as someone they thought they should be. And this authenticity transformed even difficult circumstances into opportunities for deeper understanding and creative response. As these insights settle into your consciousness tonight, let them rest without demanding immediate application. The process of becoming who one truly is unfolds according to its own natural rhythm, like a seed that sprouts when conditions are right, rather than when the gardener decides it should grow. Nietzsche's investigation into authentic selfhood led him to examine what he called the phenomenon of masks. Everyone, he realized, wore various masks in different situations, presenting different aspects of themselves depending on the social context and the roles they were expected to play. This wasn't necessarily problematic. Indeed, some degree of social adaptation was both necessary and healthy. The problem arose when people became so identified with their masks that they lost touch with what lay beneath them. They might play the role of the successful professional, the devoted parent, the loyal friend, or the spiritual seeker so consistently that they forgot these were roles rather than the totality of their identity. The truly sophisticated individual learned to wear masks consciously, choosing which aspects of themselves to emphasize in different circumstances while maintaining awareness of the fuller reality that no single role could completely express. They could be professional when professionalism was called for, playful when play was appropriate, serious when seriousness served the situation, all while remaining rooted in a deeper sense of identity that transcended any particular role. This capacity for conscious role-playing actually increased rather than diminished authenticity, because it emerged from genuine self-knowledge rather than unconscious conformity. The person who knew themselves deeply could express different aspects of their nature appropriately, while the person who lacked self-knowledge might simply react automatically to social pressures without any real choice in the matter. During his afternoon walks through Italian hill towns, when his health permitted such excursions, Nietzsche would observe the complex social dance that surrounded him with fascination. Each person navigating multiple relationships and responsibilities, each playing various roles with different degrees of consciousness and skill. Some seemed trapped by their masks, going through motions that no longer held any real meaning for them. Others moved with a kind of fluid grace, expressing genuine aspects of themselves even within the constraints of social expectation. These observations reinforced his conviction that consciousness itself was the key variable in human experience. The same external circumstances could be experienced as prison or playground, burden or opportunity, depending on the quality of awareness that one brought to them. This wasn't simply a matter of positive thinking, but of developing the kind of sophisticated understanding that could find creative possibilities even within apparent limitations. The philosopher's own experience had taught him this lesson repeatedly. His poor health had forced him to develop for depths of self-exploration mental disciplines he might never have discovered otherwise. His social isolation had created space that busier circumstances might have prevented. Even his philosophical reputation as a dangerous radical had freed him from certain social expectations that might have constrained his thinking. These apparent disadvantages had become, through conscious engagement, sources of strength and creativity. not because he pretended they weren't difficult, but because he had learned to work with them rather than simply against them, to find the hidden opportunities that existed within every challenging situation. As you drift toward deeper rest, let this possibility settle gently in your awareness. Perhaps the circumstances of your own life, even the ones that seem most limiting or frustrating, contain possibilities that haven't yet been fully explored. Not because every situation is perfect as it is, but because consciousness itself is creative, capable of discovering resources and opportunities that aren't immediately obvious. The aging philosopher, confined increasingly to his rooms but liberated increasingly in his thinking, had discovered something that would prove to be his most enduring contribution to human understanding. Freedom wasn't primarily a matter of external circumstances but of internal development. The capacity for authentic choice, creative response, and meaningful engagement could be cultivated regardless of what constraints life imposed. This wasn't the freedom of being able to do whatever one wanted, but the deeper freedom of being able to want authentically, to choose consciously, to respond creatively rather than merely reacting automatically. It was the freedom that came from understanding oneself deeply enough to make decisions that honored both one's individual nature and one's connections to the larger web of existence. Such freedom couldn't be granted by external authorities or achieved through rebellion against them. It could only be developed through the patient work of self-examination, conscious choice, and creative engagement with whatever circumstances life presented. It was simultaneously the most personal and the most universal of achievements, available to anyone willing to undertake the necessary inner work. The path beyond good and evil wasn't a rejection of all values, but the development of the capacity to create values consciously, to choose what to affirm and what to deny based on careful consideration rather than automatic reaction. It was the possibility of becoming genuinely human in the fullest sense, neither angel nor beast but something uniquely capable of conscious creativity and authentic choice. Tonight, as Nietzsche's insights continue to unfold in the quiet spaces of your consciousness, remember that this possibility isn't reserved for philosophers or exceptional individuals. It's available to anyone willing to begin the gentle work of paying attention to their own authentic responses, of questioning inherited assumptions, of gradually developing the capacity for conscious choice and creative engagement. The mountain paths still wind through unexplored territories of human potential. The journey beyond good and evil continues, not as a destination to be reached, but as a direction to be explored, one conscious choice at a time, one authentic response at a time, toward the full flowering of what it means to be genuinely, creatively, joyfully human. In the gathering dusk of his extraordinary intellectual journey, as shadows lengthened across the cobblestones outside his window, Nietzsche found himself contemplating what would become perhaps his most radical and transformative insight. It emerged not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow dawning, like the first pale light of morning creeping across a landscape that had been shrouded in darkness for centuries. He had spent years dismantling the foundations of traditional morality, tracing the genealogy of values back to their human origins, exposing the ways that inherited beliefs shaped consciousness without our awareness. But now, in these quiet evening hours when the world seemed suspended between day and night, he began to glimpse what might be possible once that demolition work was complete. Picture the philosopher in his simple chair, his failing eyes turned toward the window where the last light of day was fading into star-filled darkness. His notebooks lay scattered around him, filled with fragments and insights that were beginning to coalesce into something unprecedented in the history of human thought. He was on the verge of articulating a vision of human potential that would challenge everything the Western world believed about the nature of existence, meaning, and possibility. As you settle deeper into rest tonight, let yourself enter that same quality of receptive stillness. There's no urgency here, no pressure to grasp or achieve or become anything other than what you already are. Simply rest in the gentle awareness that consciousness itself is a kind of miracle, capable of depths and possibilities that most of us barely glimpse in our ordinary waking hours. The insight that was crystallizing in Nietzsche's awareness had to do with what he began to call the eternal return, though not in the literal sense that many of his later interpreters would assume. This wasn't a cosmological theory about the cyclical nature of time, but rather a psychological experiment of the most profound kind, a test of one's fundamental relationship to existence itself. Imagine, he suggested, that you were confronted with the possibility that your life, exactly as you have lived it and are living it, with all its joys and sorrows, triumphs and failures, moments of glory and periods of despair, would repeat itself endlessly, identically throughout eternity. Every pleasure would return, but so would every pain, every moment of love, but also every moment of loss, every creative breakthrough, but also every mistake and limitation. How would such knowledge affect your relationship to your present choices? Would you be crushed by the weight of infinite repetition, or would you discover within yourself the capacity to embrace even the difficult aspects of your existence? Could you learn to live in such a way that you would welcome the eternal return of every moment, every choice, every response to whatever life presents? The question wasn't meant to be answered quickly or easily, like some philosophical riddle with a clever solution. Instead, it was designed to serve as what he called a spiritual exercise, a way of testing the depth of your life affirmation, the genuineness of your capacity to find meaning and value even in suffering and limitation. As this possibility drifts through your consciousness tonight, let it rest without demanding immediate resolution. The eternal return wasn't a doctrine to be believed or rejected, but an imaginative experiment to be lived with, explored gradually, allowed to work its transformative effects over time like water, slowly reshaping stone. Someone who could genuinely embrace the eternal return of their existence would be someone who had developed what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate. Not the passive resignation that accepts whatever happens without feeling or response, but the active embrace that finds ways to create meaning and beauty from whatever materials life provides, regardless of how challenging those materials might appear. This love of fate wasn't something that could be forced or manufactured through willpower alone. It emerged naturally from a deeper understanding of one's self and one's place in the larger flow of existence. Like a skilled artist who could create something beautiful from whatever colours happened to be available, the person who had developed amor fati learned to work creatively with whatever circumstances arose. During his long evening contemplations, Nietzsche began to understand that this capacity for fate love was actually the highest expression of what he had been calling the will to power. Not power in the sense of domination over others, but power in the sense of creative mastery over one's own responses, the ability to transform any experience into an opportunity for growth, understanding, or authentic expression. The will to power, properly understood, was the fundamental drive of all life to overcome its limitations, to grow beyond its current boundaries, to create new possibilities from whatever conditions existed. It operated not only in obviously creative activities like art and philosophy, but in every genuine response to difficulty, every moment of choosing growth over stagnation, every act of transforming pain into wisdom. Even the smallest daily choices could be expressions of this creative power. The decision to approach a difficult conversation with curiosity rather than defensiveness, the choice to find something interesting in a tedious task, the willingness to learn from a mistake rather than simply regretting it, all represented victories of creative consciousness over the tendency toward reactive passivity. As you lie there in the gentle darkness, consider your own relationship to the challenges in your life. Are there difficulties you face that might be transformed through a different quality of attention, a more creative approach, a willingness to find growth opportunities hidden within apparent obstacles? The shift might be subtle, more a matter of inner orientation than external action, but the effects could be profound. This understanding led Nietzsche to examine what he called the hierarchy of values that operated within every individual consciousness. Most people, he realized, had never consciously examined the implicit ranking system that determined which things they considered most important, which goals took precedence over others, which aspects of life received the most attention and energy. These hierarchies had usually been inherited from family, culture, and social environment, rather than being consciously chosen. Someone might spend their entire life pursuing goals that had been programmed into them during childhood, without ever asking whether those goals truly served their authentic development or genuine happiness. But the hierarchy of values could be consciously examined and gradually restructured. Through patient self-observation, one could begin to notice which activities generated genuine satisfaction, as opposed to mere social approval, which relationships supported authentic self-expression, rather than simply providing security or status, which forms of work felt meaningful rather than merely obligatory. The process wasn't about rejecting all inherited values, but about taking conscious ownership of them, choosing to affirm those that served authentic growth while gradually releasing those that had become dead weight. Like a gardener who pruned plants not to destroy them but to encourage healthier growth, the conscious individual learned to refine their value system in service of fuller flourishing. This refinement required what Nietzsche called psychological subtlety, the capacity to distinguish between authentic desires and conditioned responses, between genuine preferences and automatic reactions. Most people had learned to want what they were supposed to want rather than discovering what they actually wanted, and this confusion created endless internal conflict and dissatisfaction. But psychological subtlety could be developed through the same kind of patient attention that any skill required. By noticing the difference between activities that generated energy and those that drained it, between relationships that supported growth and those that encouraged stagnation, between thoughts that opened possibilities and those that closed them down, one could gradually develop a more refined understanding of what truly served one's authentic nature. During his most lucid moments, when physical pain receded enough to allow clear thinking, Nietzsche experienced what he described as a profound sense of gratitude for the entire trajectory of his existence. Not just the pleasant parts, but everything, including the illness, isolation, and misunderstanding that had shaped his development in ways that comfort and easy success never could have. This gratitude wasn't sentimental or forced, but emerged from a genuine recognition of how every aspect of his experience had contributed to the development of capacities he had never known he possessed. Physical limitation had strengthened mental disciplines, social rejection had deepened self-understanding, intellectual controversy had clarified his authentic voice. He began to see that what people usually called suffering might actually be a necessary component of any genuine development, not something to be eliminated, but something to be transformed through conscious engagement. Like the resistance that strengthened muscles or the friction that sharpened blades, difficulty properly approached could become a tool for refinement rather than simply an obstacle to happiness. This perspective didn't make pain pleasant or eliminate the natural desire to avoid unnecessary hardship, but it did transform the meaning of unavoidable difficulties, turning them from mere obstacles into opportunities for discovering strengths and developing capacities that might never have emerged under easier circumstances. As these insights settle into your consciousness tonight, let them rest gently rather than demanding immediate application. The transformation of one's relationship to difficulty is typically a gradual process, like the way a river slowly carves new channels through landscape, patient and persistent rather than sudden and dramatic. The philosopher's investigation into the creative possibilities hidden within limitation led him to formulate what he considered one of his most practical insights, the principle of selective affirmation. Instead of trying to accept everything equally, or reject everything that caused discomfort, one could learn to say yes consciously to those aspects of experience that served authentic development, while saying no to those that merely perpetuated unconscious patterns. This wasn't a matter of cherry-picking only pleasant experiences while avoiding all difficulty, but rather of developing the discrimination to distinguish between productive and unproductive forms of challenge, between difficulties that led to growth and those that simply repeated old patterns without generating new understanding. Some forms of discomfort were genuinely worthwhile, like the strain of learning a new skill, or the vulnerability of honest communication, or the uncertainty of creative exploration. These difficulties served authentic development even when they felt uncomfortable in the moment. Other forms of suffering were merely habitual, like the repetitive worry that changed nothing, or the resentment that poisoned present experience without altering past events. Learning to make this distinction became one of the most valuable practical applications of Nietzsche's philosophical insights. The person who had developed this capacity could embrace challenges that served their genuine development while learning to avoid or minimize those that were merely draining or destructive. The discrimination wasn't always easy or obvious. Sometimes what felt like productive difficulty in the moment turned out to be merely habitual suffering, while experiences that seemed pointless or frustrating revealed unexpected gifts of growth and understanding. The capacity for accurate discernment developed gradually, through patient attention to the actual results that different approaches produced over time. But even imperfect efforts to apply this principle could yield significant benefits. Simply asking the question, is this difficulty serving my authentic development or merely perpetuating old patterns, could begin to shift one's relationship to challenge in more conscious and creative directions. As you rest in the quiet darkness, let yourself consider your own relationship to the various forms of resistance you encounter in daily life. Are there challenges you avoid that might actually serve your growth if approached with courage and skill? Are there forms of suffering you accept habitually that might be transformed through a different approach or quality of attention? The philosopher's exploration of selective affirmation led him naturally to examine what he called the economy of attention, the ways that consciousness could be managed more skillfully to support authentic flourishing, rather than simply reacting to whatever seemed most urgent or emotionally compelling in any given moment. Human awareness, he realized, was like a spotlight that illuminated whatever it focused upon while leaving everything else in relative darkness. Where that spotlight was directed determined not only what was noticed, but also what developed and strengthened over time. Attention was both a scarce resource and a creative force, capable of transforming experience through the quality of awareness that was brought to it. Most people had never learned to direct their attention consciously. They allowed it to be captured by habits, anxieties, social pressures, and random stimuli without considering whether that focus served their deeper interests. They might spend mental energy worrying about things they couldn't control while neglecting areas where conscious engagement could make a real difference. But attention could be trained like any other capacity. Through gentle practice, one could learn to notice when awareness was being pulled toward unproductive patterns and gradually develop the ability to redirect it toward more beneficial focuses. This wasn't a matter of rigid control, but of developing the kind of flexibility that allowed for conscious choice about where mental and emotional energy was invested. The practice began simply with noticing. Throughout the day, one could periodically ask, "Where is my attention right now? And is this focus serving my authentic development?" Often, the answer would reveal automatic patterns that hadn't been conscious before, the worried mind spinning through scenarios that would probably never occur, the comparing mind measuring oneself against others, the planning mind trying to control future outcomes that were largely beyond influence. Simply noticing these patterns without immediately trying to change them could begin to create space for more conscious choices about where to direct awareness. Like developing any skill, the capacity for selective attention strengthened gradually through consistent, gentle practice rather than through force or self-criticism. During his periods of clearest thinking, Nietzsche experienced what he described as a kind of attention that was both focused and spacious, concentrated yet relaxed. He could become completely absorbed in following a line of philosophical reasoning while simultaneously remaining aware of the larger context. The room around him, the sounds from the street below, the rhythm of his own breathing. This quality of awareness seemed to generate insights that weren't available when attention was either too scattered to focus deeply or too narrow to perceive connections and possibilities. It was as if consciousness itself became more creative when it learned to balance intensity with openness, precision with receptivity. The philosopher began to suspect that this optimal quality of attention might be cultivable through practice, like a musician developing their ear or an athlete refining their coordination. If so, then one of the most practical applications of his philosophical insights might be the development of more skillful ways of paying attention to experience. As you settle deeper into rest, let your own attention become naturally more spacious and relaxed. There's no need to focus intensely or control your thoughts. Simply allow awareness to become gently receptive to whatever arises without immediately judging or trying to change anything. This quality of open, accepting attention might itself be a form of wisdom, a way of being present that honors both the complexity of experience and the natural capacity of consciousness to find its own optimal rhythm. The cultivation of attention led Nietzsche to examine what he called the phenomenon of creative solitude, the capacity to be alone with oneself in ways that were nourishing rather than merely isolating. Most people, he observed, were uncomfortable with genuine solitude because they had never learned to appreciate their own company or to find meaning in activities that didn't require external validation. But creative solitude was different from loneliness. It was the capacity to engage with one's own thoughts, feelings, and creative impulses in ways that were genuinely satisfying, to find companionship in the process of conscious exploration and authentic self-expression. People who had developed this capacity could be alone without being lonely, could find meaning in activities that served their own development, rather than depending entirely on social interaction for stimulation and validation. This didn't mean rejecting all social connection or becoming misanthropic. Rather, it meant developing a sufficiently rich inner life that one could participate in relationships from a position of strength rather than neediness, offering genuine presence rather than simply seeking to fill internal voids through external contact. The person who was comfortable with creative solitude could be more authentically present in social situations because they weren't desperately seeking something from others that they couldn't provide for themselves. They could listen more carefully, respond more authentically, and offer more generous attention because their basic needs for meaning and validation were already being met through their own conscious engagement with life. During his long evenings alone, when illness prevented social interaction and correspondence became increasingly difficult, Nietzsche discovered that solitude could become a kind of creative laboratory where insights emerged that might never have developed in busier circumstances. The quiet space allowed for forms of reflection and inner exploration that required extended periods of uninterrupted attention. He began to understand that what many people feared about solitude, the confrontation with their own unedited thoughts and feelings, was actually one of its greatest gifts. In the absence of external distractions, it became possible to notice patterns of thinking and feeling that remained invisible during busier periods. Internal conflicts that were usually drowned out by activity could be examined and potentially resolved. This self-examination wasn't always comfortable, but it was invariably educational. Like an archaeologist carefully excavating layers of accumulated material, the person who embraced creative solitude could gradually distinguish between authentic responses and conditioned reactions, between genuine interests and inherited expectations. As you lie alone with your thoughts tonight, consider your own relationship to solitude. Are there aspects of being alone with yourself that you find nourishing and creative? Are there ways that quiet time away from external demands allows for insights or self-understanding that might not emerge in busier circumstances? The capacity for creative solitude might be one of the most valuable gifts you could give yourself, a foundation for authentic self-knowledge that supports more genuine engagement with others and with life itself. The philosopher's exploration of solitude led him naturally to examine the relationship between individual development and social contribution. One of the most persistent misunderstandings of his work was the assumption that his emphasis on self-creation and authentic individual expression was inherently selfish or antisocial. But Nietzsche had observed that people who had learned to be genuinely themselves were actually more capable of generous and creative engagement with their communities than those who remained trapped in reactive patterns or unconscious conformity. The individual who had developed authentic self-knowledge and conscious value creation had something genuine to offer others. They could contribute from their strengths rather than their wounds, give from abundance rather than trying to fill internal voids through external service. Their presence itself became a gift, an example of what was possible when someone learned to live consciously and creatively. Conversely, those who had never learned to be comfortable with themselves often became burdens on their communities, seeking through external relationships and activities what they had never developed internally. Their apparent altruism might actually be disguised neediness, their social engagement a way of avoiding the inner work that authentic development required. This didn't mean that all social service was merely disguised selfishness, but rather that the quality of one's contribution depended significantly on the quality of one's relationship with oneself. The person who had learned to find meaning through their own conscious engagement with life could offer that same quality of presence to others, while the person who depended entirely on external validation had little genuine nourishment to share. As these insights drift through your awareness, let them settle without creating pressure for immediate self-evaluation or change. The relationship between individual development and social contribution is complex and subtle, evolving gradually as understanding deepens and authentic capacities develop. Tonight simply rest in the possibility that becoming more genuinely yourself might ultimately serve not only your own flourishing, but also your capacity to contribute something valuable to the larger human conversation. The dying light outside Nietzsche's window had given way to star-filled darkness, and the philosopher found himself contemplating what would prove to be his most enduring legacy. Not any particular doctrine or belief system, but the demonstration that human consciousness was far more creative and flexible than most people ever realized. The capacity for conscious value creation, for authentic self-expression, for finding meaning through one's own efforts rather than inheriting it from external authorities, represented a form of freedom that was available to anyone willing to undertake the necessary inner work. This freedom wasn't the absence of all constraints, but the development of creative capacity that could work skillfully with whatever constraints existed. Like a jazz musician who found creative expression within the structure of chord progressions and rhythmic patterns, the conscious individual learned to dance with limitations rather than simply being defeated by them. The path beyond good and evil wasn't a destination but a direction, a way of approaching life with curiosity rather than rigid judgment, with creative engagement rather than passive resignation. It offered the possibility of becoming genuinely human in the fullest sense, neither angel nor beast, but something uniquely capable of conscious creativity and authentic choice. Tonight, as his insights continue to unfold in the quiet spaces of your consciousness, remember that this possibility isn't reserved for philosophers or exceptional individuals. It's available to anyone willing to begin the gentle work of paying attention to their own authentic responses, of questioning inherited assumptions, of gradually developing the capacity for conscious choice and creative engagement with whatever life presents. The mountain paths still wind through unexplored territories of human potential, patient and eternal, waiting for each new traveller to discover what lies beyond the familiar territories of automatic reaction and unconscious conformity. The journey continues, not as a burden to be borne, but as an adventure to be embraced, one conscious moment at a time, toward the full flowering of what it means to be genuinely, creatively, joyfully alive. And so we reach the gentle end of our journey through Nietzsche's revolutionary landscape of thought, where we've wandered together through valleys of questioning and peaks of possibility. Tonight, we've traced the path of a solitary philosopher who dared to imagine that human beings might be far more creative, far more capable of authentic joy, far more free than they had ever been taught to believe. We've seen how the death of old certainties need not lead to despair, but can open space for something unprecedented. The possibility of becoming genuinely ourselves, creators of meaning rather than merely inheritors of it. From his early insights about the dance between Apollo and Dionysus, through his genealogy of morals, to his vision of the Ubermensch and the eternal return, Nietzsche offered not a system to be believed, but an invitation to experiment, to explore, to gradually develop capacities for authentic self-expression that most of us never knew we possessed. His gift to us isn't a set of answers, but a quality of questioning, a way of approaching life with curiosity rather than rigid judgment, with creative engagement rather than passive acceptance. The journey beyond good and evil continues in your own life, in your own choices, in your own patient development of the capacity to create beauty and meaning from whatever materials existence provides. As you drift into sleep tonight, carry with you this gentle truth, that the mountain paths of consciousness still wind through unexplored territories, patient and eternal, waiting for you to discover what lies beyond inherited belief in the creative heart of authentic human existence. The philosopher's voice may fade, but the possibility he revealed remains, quiet and eternal as the stars themselves. Sweet dreams, fellow traveller. The journey continues with each conscious breath, each authentic choice, each moment of becoming more genuinely, creatively, joyfully yourself.